All right, thank you so much. Good evening. My name is Sophia, and I'm a master's student here at the Yale School of the Environment. Thank you all for joining us for the Material Energy Nexus. We believe that the energy transition is one of the greatest challenges of our lifetime. Our aim in hosting this event is to spark an intersectional dialogue about materials required for said transition. We are honored to be joined here today by Dr. Tom Graedel, Dr. Saleem Ali, Dr. Anik Antal, Michael Holloman, Sarah Stewart, Abigail Hunter. I would also like to shine a light on my co-organizers, Isabel Campbell, Ali Garrett, Cece Gong, and an extra special shout out to Tessa Lee for spearheading this event. I'll soon turn the mic over to Dr. Tom Graedel for the first keynote to give an overview of critical metals. Then we will have a second keynote followed by a panel discussion. And finally, a networking dinner. After each keynote, we will have 5 minutes for questions. I'll note that there will not be a break between the talks, so if you need to slip out, the restrooms are located along the side of this building, right up here, and also towards the back, towards the big windows. And if you need water, there is a water fountain by the top of the stairs. If after the event you would like to continue the conversation, Abigail Hunter and the Kimball Smith series are hosting small group conversations later this week. Please reach out to CC Gong if you're interested. All right, now on to our first keynote. Dr. Tom Graedel is a professor emeritus of industrial ecology and chemical engineering. Professor Graedel was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Engineering for outstanding contributions to the theory and practice of industrial ecology. His research is centered on developing and enhancing industrial ecology. He quite literally wrote the book. His textbook, Industrial Ecology, co-written with B.R. Allenby, was the first book in the field. A round of applause for Dr. Tom Graedel.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming to this event, which I think is very special. Let's see now if I know how to do this. Okay, good. So there's the title, and I've been warned that I have 20 minutes, so we better get going here. This is my favorite diagram, probably yours too, the periodic table of the elements. And if you look at which elements are not radioactive, the answer is about 81. So assuming we don't want to put a lot of radioactive elements in our products, 81 is what we have to play with. And it's interesting to see what product designers and developers have done with this. There we are. So we can look at the phone that almost everyone has in his or her pocket and say, well, how many elements are in this thing? It varies a little among manufacturers, but the average is 63 or 64. In other words, about 70% of all elements you could possibly use are in the phone. How about automobiles? A group from MIT and Ford got together about 3 years ago to figure out how many elements were in one of the modern vehicles, still a gasoline vehicle, modern, but modern in every other sense. And their answer was 73. 73 different elements out of 81 that could possibly be used for anything. So modern product designers are using just about everything, and it's fair I think, for us to say, should we be concerned about this? Are there problems lurking? And that has been the impetus for this whole idea of critical materials. If we're using this, do we have to worry about anything? You can immediately think of several things we might want to worry about from this perspective. And one would probably be political instability. It turns out that the World Bank has a measure for what they call the World Governance Index. So every couple of years, they get their staff together and they figure out what is the relative governance index for a country, and plot them on here from green, no problematic issues, and red, highly problematic. And not surprising, the reds show up in Africa, parts of Asia, parts of South America. So you certainly want to bring that into the context of critical materials. Now, another thing that comes into that context is what's called companionality. This was codified, one might say, to a certain extent by a couple of people in Belgium 10 or 12 years ago, and they put mining into a picture that they called the flower garden. And this is to recognize that if you're mining copper, you also have in the same ore other metals that tend to occur there as well. Tellurium, selenium, a little bit of gold, some arsenic. If you're mining zinc, you have there indium, germanium, cadmium, and the whole flower table, the flower garden, looks something like this. The message here is that a few metals are hosts and a lot of metals are companions. So I set some students on this some years ago, and this is what we came out with in this analysis, that the score scale here is anything that is at the blue end is something that is mined for itself. Anything that's in the red end is something that you get only by having it as a byproduct of a major metal. And there are a few that are, I keep doing that, sorry. There are a few of them that are in between in the yellows and oranges. See a couple of them up here. But mostly, the message here is there's an awful lot of red out here. In 2008, recognizing some of this information and some of the problems that probably were going to emerge, the National Science Foundation and the National Academies of Engineering set up a committee to look at the question of critical materials, minerals, critical materials, and the U.S. economy. One early thing the committee decided was we have to look at a couple of axes here to judge this. One is how much is supply at risk, low to high? How about the impact of materials loss? If you can't get it, does it matter? So it doesn't matter much down here, matters a lot up here. Obviously, you have to worry quite a bit about something up here, where it's risky to get it, and it's really important if you don't. I was on this committee, and I know what happened in the hour before we finally stopped our deliberations. We sat down around a table, pulled out some of our favorite ideas about materials, and said, what do you think about this and that and the other thing? And we sprayed those materials. I'm sorry, I keep doing this. There. We sprayed those materials around this little board, put some of them high, some of them not so high. It's a product of 1 hour's work, and amazingly enough, this has been published a fair amount because people needed something. But I came back to Yale, and we decided that it was time for us to try to put some rigor into this operation. And we got what eventually turned out to be a team of 15 or 20 students working part-time here and there and wrestling with this. Barbara Reck, who's down here, was involved in this. And eventually, we came out with a methodology that adopted some of the things that the National Academy Committee had specified. There was a supply risk axis. There was a vulnerability to supply restriction axis. And we decided to have a third axis, environmental implications, so taking the environment into account as well. And so our methodology, I won't go through it, but here is political stability or lack thereof. Here's companion metal production. And other things over here like net import reliance, if you're a country that depends on imports. And if you take an element and determine, and we set everything on a 1 to 100 scale, so everything could be added and subtracted. And so if you do this for a given element, then in three-dimensional space you have what we would call our criticality assessment. I don't have time to go through an example in detail, so I'm going to skip past that example. But for the element indium, here's where it shows up in 3 dimensions. High supply risk, low environmental impact, reasonably high vulnerability. And if you take the elements that usually occur with indium in the mines and plot them all together, then you have this group. And as you can see, there's a range because the supply risk for some of them differs from others. The environmental implications differs, and to a lesser extent, the vulnerability differs somewhat. We were careful not to put a boundary on this to say, here's a line, and if it's above, it's a critical material. If it's below, it's not. We didn't think we knew how to do that. But governmental agencies go past that problem. And here's a map of, this is the 2-axis map now, a version of it that the European Union put out. And they decided, well, what we're going to do is to say anything above this line on the criticality assessment, this is supply risk. Anything that's above this line for supply risk is worthy of special treatment. Anything that's above here in economic importance is something to be worried about. And so anything in this group, as far as the EU is concerned, is a critical material. Now, this has some problems because if you look closely here, you can see we've got a couple of them that are just above the borderline and a couple of them that are just below the line. And how much do we really trust that line? At any rate, they did that. Other governments have done it. And now here's what you get with the 5 governments that have recently published criticality tables. And if you look at this, you see that almost everything is there. Some of you, like me, may be fans of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, the group in England that wrote these 40 years ago, maybe. In The Gondoliers, for reasons I won't go into, all the people in the play are given titles, Lord of this and Lord of that. And one of the bystanding actors says, if everyone is somebody, then no one's anybody. And so here we have Gilbert and Sullivan. And so I say on this account, well, if every element is critical, then maybe no element is critical. Well, let's go on to talk a little bit about energy and how that plays into the picture. If you look at different energy technologies, wind, solar, batteries, nuclear, you have a set of elements that are really needed to make the stuff that we're using for the energy transition. And I would call to mind energy transmission as another one that needs a lot of elements. The reason for this is obvious once explained. Our energy grid, I'm talking the United States here, but it applies other places as well. Our energy grid is built on producing energy in coal-fired power plants, gas-fired power plants, and so forth, and then sending it to the big industrial areas and the big population areas. In the transition, we're going to be putting solar power where it's sunshine. That might not be where these other things are. We're going to be putting wind power where there's a lot of wind. Again, there may not be a lot of people or a lot of industry there. So, here are the critical materials for energy applications. And there's about 20 here, 21, I think. So what this means is the energy transition needs to look pretty carefully at these 20 or 21 materials, which are going to find their demands going up big time in the next 2 or 3 decades. But to go back to the energy communications thing, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory a couple of years ago put out this picture of what energy transmission would have to look like in 2035 for us to meet the challenges that have been proposed for green energy. And we have here, we have here major transition that has to occur pretty much all over the country, but especially in the main population centers, industrial centers. So this is a challenge for the energy transition from a materials standpoint. Pay attention to some 20 materials, but don't forget that once you produce the energy, you got to get it to where it's going to be used. Well, let me sum up here, because I know Tessa's going to start yelling at me a minute here. Too many materials, in my view, are designated as critical. But almost all elements are very important for certain uses. So we really probably do need them all, but we have to be careful of all of them. And finally, that statement certainly applies to the clean energy technologies. So there we have critical materials, there we have clean energy technology connections, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graedel, for the introduction to the topic. And I also appreciate a bit of opera history. So we have time for 2 questions.
Thank you. I'd be curious if you think that there are too many critical mineral designations. Would you prefer that there were sub-designations for different energy uses, or what's your solution to the overcasting of the critical mineral definition?
I'm probably better at pointing out the problems than the solutions. But 2 or 3 years ago, Barbara Reck and Alessio Miato and I tried to say, what are the ones that have really, their business is having special uses? And we don't use much of them, but we use, when we need them, we really need them. There aren't any decent substitutes. And we came out with, I think, 9, Barbara? And for want of a better term, we call them spice metals. It takes a little bit of spice to do the job. So that's our spice metal group. Probably the other group these days would be some version of the energy metals that I just showed you, because every political statement, every cash transfer seems to go in the direction of pushing up green energy, and that means pushing up an awful lot of minds around the world to hope that we can get the materials in time to support what we're planning.
Maggie?
I'm curious if you could, in the graph that you had about how you determine what was critical, there was a component of that talks about supply chain resilience. And I wonder if you could talk about how circularity informed your understanding of what is like a resilient material or an element in this. Meaning, like, I'm sitting here coming from a perspective of, as a student in industrial ecology classes, thinking, okay, I want to focus on issues that we can incorporate into a circular economy. How do you think about the circular economy when you think about designating what we should think about as critical materials?
I guess I would take a little different tack with that and to say we aren't going to have a circular economy for any material unless we figure out how to use it more than once. The picture one has, especially with solar cells and some of the really high-tech technologies, is people in very highly filtered rooms in bunny suits producing all this wonderful stuff. If you go to the what we call a recycling center these days, which used to have other names, there you see guys in sweatshirts throwing pieces of metal around. The technology and the sophistication is so different at the start and at the end. And if we don't get it right at the end, we're never going to use anything more than once, and we're just going downhill on that one. So I would start not by trying to redesignate something in the criticality space. I'd start with trying to get the people at the scrapyards into bunny suits, and that depends on the product designers realizing that that has to work that way.
Thanks so much. And now I'd like to pass the baton to my colleague Isabel to introduce the next keynote.
Hi, I might just first ask, if you're willing in terms of COVID safety to just squish up a little bit. We've got people still trickling in terms of seating, and so that would kind of free up a little bit of space. Thanks. Great, thank you for that. So now I'm excited to announce our second speaker of the night, Dr. Saleem Ali. So Saleem is a blue and gold distinguished professor of energy and the environment at the University of Delaware. He's also an MESc graduate of the Yale School of the Environment's predecessor, the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So we're welcoming home tonight, which is nice. So his research focuses on the causes and consequences of environmental factors, how ecological factors can promote peace, and environmental conflicts in extractive industries, especially minerals. And he's written a number of books, including Treasures of the Earth, Need, Greed, and a Sustainable Future, and Earthly Order, How Our Natural Laws Define Human Life. He's also a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel. So all in all, he's really well placed to help us explore the issues surrounding critical minerals. And so here he is with his talk titled Fixing Mixed Messages on Critical Materials.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to follow Tom. I should note that I was a student in the first class on industrial ecology, which Tom taught here in 1995, when that textbook that was referenced was not even yet published. We were using the preprints of the book for the course with Brad Allenby, and Tom was commuting from New Jersey when he was at AT&T. So it's a real honor to be back and to share the stage with Tom. I'm going to try and give you a bit of a provocative exposition around what is happening now with critical materials policy. I operate at this interface between science and policy. I was trained in the natural sciences. My first degree was in chemistry, but I moved more and more towards the applied social sciences in terms of my research and practice. And so I work in these interstitial spaces, which are often outside the comfort zone of most reductionist activity. But hopefully you will still see that there's depth and not just breadth in what I have to say. So, we're dealing with what is often referred to as the green paradox of criticality. Metals are critically needed, as Tom has noted, for this transition, but the environmental movement is really in a bit of a fix with what to do with this transition, because the processes of extraction have gone against many of their fundamental positions around land use, environmental pollution, and so on and so forth. So this is the real paradox, that we need these critical minerals, but the path to extraction has really left a lot of environmentalists in a tizzy. And so we're getting mixed messages. And incidentally, I don't know if this was by design, but today is the 2-year anniversary of an executive order from President Biden. And, living and working in Delaware, I'm very close to sort of the ways in which the Biden administration has thought about these issues. But this is sort of going down memory lane, what's been happening with reference to critical metals in the last 2 years. And this, of course, goes back to even President Trump's era. And this is one of those fields which is sort of bipartisan. And the Biden executive order referred to the Trump executive order, which had also, of course, laid forth similar kinds of concerns. That's the title of the Trump executive order, which was framed around the concerns around China and reliance on particular minerals there and so on. So we're dealing with an area that the Washington, D.C. establishment is very much involved in and trying to come up with new policies regularly. But the challenge I see is the mixed messaging that we're getting, which is likely to lead to an impasse. And as an environmental conflict resolution professional and someone who's also trained as a mediator, I find that particularly challenging because people are not thinking of it in those terms. Now, one way in which it's been presented is like we have to think about friend shoring. I don't know how many of you have heard of this term, friend shoring. Okay, so there's one for your lexicon now. Friend shoring is the concept that we should be sourcing critical minerals from our friends. So, you like when you're short on soup, you go and knock on your friend's door. Well, the problem is critical minerals are not like soup in a can, and you're going to end up with trouble if you are going to just think that friend shoring is going to work in the same way. So there is this whole literature on friend shoring that's emerging, where the US is saying, we are going to have our buddies, Canada and Australia, and a few other nice countries here and there who are going to give us the minerals we need. And all those other people we don't want to deal with, they have governance problems, or they've got intellectual property problems, or so on and so forth. This is a very challenging time. I can understand the logic of it at some level. Of course, every country has a right to have some security implications around what they source, and it's sensible to think about it. But minerals are determined by geology, and so it's going to be very challenging if we're going to go that route for one reason. And then there are other efficiency aspects. So if you're a systems scientist, you're going to try and think about what's the most energy efficient place where you can extract the minerals, how can you have the full supply chain put forward. So just at Davos, the head of the World Trade Organization cautioned everyone to think through this carefully. You can have friend shoring, but consider what the implications would be. With reference to, even if you look at projections from the WTO, it would be a 5% decline in global GDP if we started to have what we refer to as this bipolar world, again, going back to the same kind of world we had in the Cold War, where we had the US and the USSR, and the case now is it going to be the US and China, the bipolar world. It would lead to a reduction in the efficiency of the global economic system. But also the other part, which goes to my role with the United Nations. I come originally from a developing country, from Pakistan, and I'm very concerned about the implications for developing countries of this kind of an approach. Because this is what, of course, University of Chicago professor, as well as the former chief economist for the IMF and also the governor of the Central Bank of India, Raghuram Rajan, he noted that this kind of an approach, it is going to disproportionately impact poorer countries, because it will be very easy to immediately say, oh, they don't have good governance, and so we cannot source from them. They're just, you're going to be stigmatized if you do that. And we are seeing this happen already. So this is a summary of what's happened in the last 2 years. I'll leave these slides available, and I think the event is being recorded, so you can go through this in more detail. I don't have time to go through this now. But this is just a quick stock take I did last week of what has actually happened with one of my PhD students. And basically, the 2 years of these executive orders, not much has happened in terms of impact yet. In fact, the mine production in the US has gone down, and even recycling rates have gone down. So something is not happening. Now, people might say, well, there's a time lag. We need more time. Mining takes 10 to 15 years to develop. Rare earths is an exception. Rare earths is interesting, that rare earths production has gone up. And in fact, MP Materials has done pretty well on that count. But my other concern is that the rare earths, and this goes back to this kind of the media's involvement in this narrative. Rare earths are very seductive when you hear about, people talking about rare earth elements. Like, wow, I get so many calls from reporters all over the world, and they just want to talk about rare earths. I'm like, rare earths from a quantity perspective are minuscule. They are important, but they are not consequential like so many of these other metals. But because they are, just the term gives that allure, you have people talking about them. So actually, that's the area where you've had a little bit more traction, but not in the ways we would want. So then you have this cobalt lithium conundrum that, the electric car batteries, which is going to be one of the major areas of the green transition. Right now, you've got the lithium-ion battery technology that uses cobalt as an important electrode metal. But you've got now this whole stigmatization of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country I have spent time in, and it's a country with a very sad history, of course. But well-intentioned people, like this journalist gentleman, Siddharth Kara, very, noble-hearted person who's written this book just published last week called Cobalt Red. He was interviewed by, people recognize that chap up there, Joe Rogan, 11 million podcast audience right away, right? This is not the usual type of guy Joe Rogan would interview. Why did he interview him? The messaging was, all these greenies telling you to get electric cars, they're causing all of this anguish in Congo. Shame on them. Fossil fuels are much cleaner. You're getting them in good old Montana and Wyoming and so on and so forth. Why are you doing this? These electric car people, they are the scourge of the earth. So this is what's happening now. You've got this conflict that is emerging. Now what are they going to do? Well, they're going to say, okay, we don't want to use cobalt. We're going to find another way. Okay, lithium iron phosphate batteries. They're going to solve the day. Well, industrial ecology folks, you have to do the analysis. You look at the data. So look at these star diagrams or spider web diagrams, whatever you want to call them. Looking at the different battery technologies, there will always be some trade-offs, right? And that foundational learning, unfortunately, is absent among journalists. It's absent among policymakers. And so you end up with this wishful thinking. So what do we get then? Well, you get this messaging continuing. You've got all this opposition to extraction. So the Biden administration also last week with the Department of Interior decided not to move forward with mining in Minnesota in those areas where there could have been really important reserves because, okay, there was a trade-off. Of course, this is a wilderness area which has specialty, but there's no free lunch in the universe. So where are we going to go in terms of this approach then? And then, of course, now you have polarization in Congress with the House and the Senate. So the new House Committee on Natural Resources, which is now Republican-led, immediately retorted. You have Pete Stauber from Minnesota. He called it an attack on our way of life. And you had Bruce Westerman from Arkansas, who's the chair. He said this is short-sighted, foolish, and completely unscientific. Of course, they're doing their own theater. So you have the theater on both sides happening. Another aspect of this that I've spent a lot of time on is on deep-sea mining. Now, on deep-sea mining, if you actually do an LCA from a social LCA perspective, right, life cycle analysis from a social impact perspective, actually deep-sea mining comes out really good. Why? Because you do not have cultural heritage sites. You don't have indigenous people who are going to be displaced off the deep sea. You do not have a lot of those other concerns which you do have when you have terrestrial mining. On the environmental side, we have done these analyses. There's these two papers we have published with a group of researchers, one in the Journal of Cleaner Production, the other one, Reed Lipset knows well, it was published in Journal of Industrial Ecology, happily open source thanks to a grant that YSC got. And you can look it up, where we looked at the waste impact and we looked at the carbon footprint. And the deep sea mining comes out better than terrestrial mining for these metals. But you look at the campaigns against deep-sea mining, so well-funded all over the world, and it makes you feel as though this is going to completely decimate the planet, right? And so now most recently, the biodiversity one is the one where I'm most concerned about. And there are genuine concerns about the biodiversity impacts. But How do you evaluate it? Well, that's the one we have most recently, I'm happy to report, just again, within the last month. This is very contemporary. This is the first time I'm giving this presentation. It's not a canned presentation. I actually looked, so this paper is going to be published in Biodiversity and Conservation. And this paper, I'm very fortunate to also report that we were able to get Tom Lovejoy as a co-author just before he passed away. Another great Yaley whom you probably know, had a long association with Yale, but he's the guy who coined the term biodiversity, but he was able to be an author on this paper, so it will be his last, posthumously published paper. So this is what we should be doing, but we can't. Because of why? Because you have all this muddled activism. And I put your other colleague, your Yale faculty member, on there. He's apparently in New Mexico doing field work. I sent him a message. I said, I've got you on a slide on critical metals. I said, yeah, I found a way to get you into a critical metals. So, but the problem is, you've got these people, the billionaire wilderness that Justin Farrell has talked about in his book, right? You have Jeff Bezos, who has given $100 million to one organization, environmental group here, there, and extremely well-funded environmental movement, more so than it has ever been. And I'm happy for that. My heart is with them. But if they are not going to have a systems approach to understanding these issues, they may have many victories, but the planet is not going to win. And that's my biggest concern right now that we're having. And this is becoming so, the whole issue is distorted. And then on the other hand, you have the social media situation. The Bloomberg did a study last year. They found that a lot of the Twitter trolls you're getting saying anti-mining, anti-metals, they are being actually pushed by certain Chinese entities who do not want to have mining outside of China. Fascinating. So you have all of this. And so this is really interesting. And that's why I said the friendshoring concept, it's leading China to do these things. And if we had a more sensible approach to trying to have negotiated agreement around mineral supply, we would not probably end up in this dynamic. So now what has happened is so the environmental movement has moved from saying that we should look at recycling for metals, realizing that now the data says recycling is not going to meet the demand. So now the next step is the most recent report that is up there. This also just came out recently. Very well-intentioned people who are doing this, but there's like, okay, we just have to change our entire model. We just need to change the entire transport system of the world, and then we will have less metal consumption, so we just completely, and I wish we could do it. But if you want to have a pluralistic society where you have some individual choice, you will not be able to do it for every place. You could do it maybe for some cities, like Paris was able to reduce cars by 40%, by better transport infrastructure, but can you do that in other parts of the US? Probably not. So, plus, my bigger point is you have 700 million people without electricity still. Again, as a developing country person, no reduction in conservation is going to address that. You are still going to need more metals. So either you want to wish them in the dark, or you recognize that you will need more materials. Right? So this is the problem, because there is not a systems approach to any of this. Now, in terms of, this is a paper we just published in December in Environmental Science and Technology, and we looked at the material energy nexus around, and it was also looking at some of the issues around decoupling from China, as they say, that how difficult it's going to be to decouple from China. So we looked at also, like, this is just to show you the actual material usage for solar is the highest overall, right, per terawatt hour production. So this is basically looking at that. Coal, that's why coal is so effective too, because of the material usage part, which we often miss out on, right? Hydropower, and these are different materials, so hydropower clearly uses concrete. But let's keep this in perspective. I'm all for solar, but then don't forget that the material energy nexus, which is the title of your Symposium series, this is why we have this challenge, right? Because the actual material to energy flow as Václav Smil talks about the density per se, this is what we have. So these are some other diagrams from the same paper, which I'm not going to go into, but suffice it to say China's dominance is likely to continue and we can't wish it away. Recycling is not going to solve the problem. This was data we analyzed around recycling demand with colleagues at EIT Raw Materials in Europe. And then, China has tremendous resilience in terms of metal supply security domestically produced. So this is work actually by one of the Fulbright scholars who spent time at YSC and is now at Tsinghua University, and he looked at the COVID impact on metal production, and there was hardly any impact. In fact, in some cases it went up, because there is a lot of resilience they have in their system. This is one of my other roles, which I've had with Reed and Tom as well, and serving on the International Resource Panel. But just to give you a sense of how, this is from one of the reports we did of where this all plays out in terms of the larger system. This is the kind of systems approach that we actually should be using. The other thing that I would urge is entrepreneurs. We need more. We have lots of people here who are doing dual degrees with the business school. This is a model we developed, how to bring entrepreneurs into the system. The problem with entrepreneurship is that we don't have good messaging downstream to upstream. So this is a model we suggested. It's called the Smart Mineral Enterprise Development Model, which would help with this. So it goes back a few years, this paper, but it's worth reading for those of you who are interested in this. And the other colleagues on this are from the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. So these are some ideas that have come out around also what we could do from a policy perspective. I also serve on the advisory board of an NGO called Resolve. And this is so in terms of what to do about it, here are some ideas. We could have what we call critical minerals opportunity zones. So to give it a positive spin, so to speak, in terms of where these minerals could come from and allowing for that kind of opportunity zone. And in some cases, this may require eminent domain in terms of local laws and jurisdiction issues as well. But anyhow, I don't want to go above my time, but just to go through some of the other things, we have also called for more recently that to deal with this problem of the US-China polarization, what we need is an integrated mineral supply agreement, and this could be done under the G20. My preferred venue would be actually the G20 rather than the WTO, or it could be done through IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency. Either of those venues would make this more of a comfort zone. Like if America says, look, we're so worried about China curtailing supply, what can be some kind of an agreement that would give that supply security? That doesn't mean we don't diversify. We should encourage all the great companies in Missouri doing Cobalt and all. I'm all for that. But at the same time, we should not be making castles in the air that we are going to be able to completely transition to no China minerals in 10, 15 years even, not even that. And then we have the Paris Agreement targets, which we want to meet. So we have a clear deadline on that front. How are we going to do that, right? So either you're serious about one thing or you're not. Or then are you going to bring geoengineering into the picture, right? And this is the problem. If people do not want to think as a system. And so that's the kind of work I try to do. And, my book, Earthly Order, which was alluded to, it tries to give that systems perspective. And I would urge you to consider that. I'm donating all the royalties from that book for environmental education programs, particularly in Pakistan, my country of origin. And I was really pleased, I should mention, I just put this up on the last slide, that one of the cover endorsements, it has also a cover endorsement by Roald Hoffman, who's a Nobel laureate in chemistry, but it also has an endorsement from Jared Cohen. I don't know if any of you know who he was, but he was the dean of the Yale School of Environment. And then became president of Carnegie Mellon, and I know Tom knows him from also the National Academy. So I try to keep going back to what I learned here at YSC, which was to be a systems thinker, and I'm really delighted that you've given me this opportunity to share these thoughts. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you, Saleem. That definitely gave us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure we have some questions. And we've got 5 minutes of questions again. Does anyone have any? Delaney.
Hi, thank you so much. This was great. And what I'm about to ask probably could be a presentation in and of itself, but you talked a lot about the politics of mining and getting these minerals. And can you talk a bit about the politics of waste? Because that's something that I feel like, in a similar vein to the Joe Rogan stuff, I'm in a lot of weird Facebook groups, and people are always like, oh, well, the wind turbines and blah, blah, blah. And I know nuclear waste, I'm from New Mexico, is a really big issue, so I would love for you to touch on just the politics of that area.
Yeah, it's a huge issue with, so with waste of renewable energy. So one of the things is that we have what we call the durability challenge, with any kind of circular economy. Like, you want to make things durable so that you have, ideally, the material is being used for as long as it can be. But if you have very durable materials, then you don't have stock for recycling, right? So, so where is that Goldilocks sweet spot? Is it 10 years for electric car batteries, which is what they say, that you should have 10-year battery so that then it becomes recyclable, so you wouldn't have to mine? And so that's where the waste recovery comes in. So one problem with the waste issue is that there's no doubt the classification of waste under certain environmental laws has made it very difficult to have a circular economy, right? And this, you see this time and again. I mean, like rare earths we're talking about. I visited a rare earth facility in Malaysia, and they have very low intensity thorium, which is in some of the materials that's produced as a waste, right? They could easily use that material productively in a lot of activities. And the environmental movement has been pushing to classify it as hazardous waste so it couldn't be used. And now from a science perspective, you really do a risk analysis. It does not make any sense to classify that as the kind of waste. But they're doing it because they just want to make it so difficult to develop any new kind of rare earth processing facility, right? So absolutely waste classification and how it is misused, huge problem, and we do need to address it. I believe that overall this is an area that the Europeans are doing a better job at currently than the US, but it's an absolutely pivotal issue. Yep.
Rose over there. Do we have a microphone? Oh, it's on recording, so we'll just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here today. So enlightening to hear you speak. My question is mainly about, you mentioned Paris and how there's been a great reduction of car use there because of transportation infrastructure. So my question is, what happens for the places that can't be Paris and can't or don't have such robust transportation infrastructure? Is the reduction of cars a materials problem, or is it more of a social, cultural problem? And if so, kind of, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that in terms of the large metropolitan centers, we can have dematerialization as a result of cars, and certainly resource efficiency, and Reed's the expert on this as well with our resource efficiency report from the panel, and can talk more about that in various ways, whether it's through a shared economy and calibrating it the right way, because you can have rebound effects with the shared economy, you can have other kinds of unforeseen circumstances that arise. But with reference to planning, so the report I referred to, the most recent one, there's this group, Thea Rio-Francos and at Providence College and a few others, they came up with this report saying that this push towards critical minerals, we don't need to have that many critical minerals if we completely redesign our urban infrastructure. But my biggest problem with that is that we are neglecting the developing world, which I mentioned. You've got all those people. You will still need, and I want those cities to be, I've been blessed to travel to now 162 countries thanks to some of my UN work, and most of those countries, they have to have material development. Look at the countries in Africa particularly. You cannot say they have to dematerialize because they don't have any materials to begin with right now, infrastructure, There are cities in Africa where there are no traffic lights because there's no infrastructure. So we need to think about that first. Second, you're absolutely right, you can't do it in every area. And in some cases, having cars is more efficient than actually having public transport, depending on where the size and of the location. And So then the other option is we have to move everyone to cities. I mean, do we really want to move everyone to cities? Then what do we do about rural heritage and all of those things? Those are social issues. We have to be recognizing that as social organisms, we need to have a suboptimal outcome. This is the biggest problem with environmentalism, is it's a utopian ideology. There's always this sense of the Garden of Eden. There was a great time and we'll go back to it. In the real world, if you have a social system with multiple abilities of choice, you will end up with a suboptimal outcome. And that's okay. That's what Amartya Sen told us about when he said the impossibility of a Paretian liberal. You cannot have Pareto optimality in a liberal society completely, right? And it's very hard for environmentalists to grasp that. So that's why they either gravitate towards some form of green totalitarianism, which is not good either, or they end up with these solutions which are not going to be implementable. So, and it's a pity because I know my heart is with them. I have served on boards of environmental organizations, but now, unfortunately, we're seeing this kind of dynamic. And I'm not one of the Michael Schellenberger types of, trashing all environmentalism at all. No, not at all. I'm really trying to say we need to come up with a mechanism whereby we understand the core systems boundaries on which we are operating.
Thank you. We're at time for our questions, but there will be a chance to talk to Saleem further after the event when we have dinner. So if you have any questions, find him, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer. So we'll just give him a last round of applause. We'll now have a 5-minute transition time to our panel. And so I encourage you to talk to your neighbor about this as we come up to the panel and think, where should the efforts be focused to address these challenges with critical materials and the energy transition? And for example, look at policy, finance, environmental justice, business models, technology. There are many possible approaches. And so, encourage you to have a chat about that.
Hi everyone. So you may have noticed that a few people in the front there left during the transition, and they were high school students who listened to the keynotes and are now off for a private lesson with Sophia, who introduced this event today. And so we'd like to thank Yale Pathways to Science for all their hard work in organizing to enable the high school students to join us today. For those looking for seats, there's lots in the front now. So now we'll be moving on to our panel. So first I'd like to introduce Barbara Reck, who's moderating our panel today. Barbara is a senior research assistant at the Yale Center for Industrial Ecology and is also a lead at the Remade Institute. Barbara researches the sustainability of material use in society and is an expert on materials, recycling, and criticality assessments. Barbara is joined by Dr. Anik Ansel, who is an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering at Michigan State University. Michael Holloman, who is commercial director and board member at U.S. Strategic Metals and Missouri Cobalt, and Sarah Stewart, who is the CEO and executive director at Silverado Policy Accelerator. And finally, Abigail Hunter, who is Government Affairs Attaché at the Quebec Government Office in Washington, D.C. So over to you.
Go after you. Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you very much again, Tessa, for organizing this entire event and for having prepared everything beautifully. So thanks very much. I would like to start the panel by having the panelists introduce themselves and say maybe a little bit more about their backgrounds and then also what's their relationship and their interest in critical minerals. Michael.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Tessa, and everyone for inviting me. This is a fantastic place to be and a fantastic event. We're really excited that you all are this interested in what I think we all think is a very exciting space in the world. My name is Mike Holloman. I'm a commodities trader by trade, 26 years in the commodities business. I had sort of an unconventional route into the commodities business. I went to law school down in Miami. Before that, undergrad in Florida. And I was going to go into politics. And I somehow got over to Europe and got a job at Glencore, which is the world's largest commodities trading company. It's formerly known as Mark Rich. It has an up and down history, but I can tell you it is still the University of Commodities Trading. If you want to know anything about oil and gas, coal, metals, this is the company that moves more of it than anyone else in the world. It's thought of by a lot of people as the company that makes the world go around, because their portions of all the big metals and oil and gas and coal are so large. They're also about the 6th largest mining company. But I got into that company through some friendships. I didn't know anything about commodities trading, so I just landed as a rookie traffic person in the office in Zug, Switzerland, and I was handling these documents, these multi-million-dollar documents, giant Cape-sized vessels going from Australia to Japan and going from Russia to the US, and I was doing these letters of credit, $10 million. I had no idea what I was really doing, but 6 years later, I kind of understood the flow of the materials around the world and how it worked. And then I got the opportunity to be a trader, and they shipped me off to Moscow, Russia, and I really cut my teeth trading in a totally different Russia. I mean, the Russia of today is one of the worst things that's happened maybe in our lifetime, what's going on in Russia. But when I moved to Russia, it was 1999, and Putin had just come into power. The Russian people were very pro-US. I went all around Russia, going to all the ports. I went to Siberia, to all the mines. And there was a real kind of moment to bring Russia in-house. And then, of course, oil prices go to $172 a barrel. And they're geniuses suddenly. They don't need help from anybody. And they're the smartest people on the planet. They were making so much money. But it was a circuitous route of commodities trading. I also spent about 6 years in Africa, in and out of Africa, watching what happened. And basically, my background, leads me to be able to say that I have seen what has come now. I watched as our big geopolitical current rival was there scooping up all of the metals, and we were not there. And now I work for a company that is trying to fight back in a small way, but we're a mine in Missouri that is doing cobalt, nickel, copper. We're trying to make a green mining, green energy platform. We're a Superfund site that is going to really change the way that I think America thinks about the energy transition, that it can be done here. So that's my long-winded introduction. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much.
Apologies.
Anik.
Hi, everyone. Well, it's great to be here. I love industrial ecology, so it's great to meet so many people that are interested in that kind of discussion. So my name is Anik. I'm originally from Quebec, so that's great too to have somebody else from the same place. I'm French-Canadian. But my mom is from a town called Cobalt, so my grandfather was actually work in the mine, and my dad was worked for the electrical company doing all the electricity for the remote area in Quebec for indigenous people. So I try really hard to go into something else. So I started as biomedical engineering, trying to do other things, but finally I got really interested in working in solar. So I moved to the US to do a PhD, a master in material engineering. So my background is all material engineering. I started a PhD in microsystems. So I was working in the bunny suit, trying to do the best solar panels, mostly for space application. And what happened is I realized we were trying to make those gaining a little bit of efficiency, making better solar panels, and all my colleagues and other people, all they look at the periodic table is just what the price of the material is, how can I get just a little bit more efficiency, not really thinking about the material they were putting in those solar panels. So trying to put gold and silver and europium and weird materials, and like you're kind of missing the point. We're not going to solve any problem with energy if we keep adding new materials that are really scarce, and that's not scalable. So I switched PhD after my qualifier, so I did qualifier twice, which is not the best idea ever, but so I switched to sustainability, and that's really was like a great call for me. I was really more interested in that broader aspect of energy and looking at materials from like where do materials come from, how do we use them in particular for energy application, and the impact of producing energy materials for, in particular, solar, but also I work on wind turbines. I work closely with Ford on recycling second life batteries. I've worked on nuclear. So I work on a lot of different energy technology because it's important also to be able to compare each of them. Compared to what I've been discussed maybe so far, what I like to study, because my background is in making solar cells, I like to look at future technology. So like how are we going to make solar panels in like 5 or 10 years, and like what are the other materials we're going to need as we're transitioning. So a lot of and same thing with like batteries, they are like the chemistry is changing very quickly, and like even if like how are we going to deal with all this waste if what we're making now is different than what we add in the waste stream and so on. So that's really what my research interest is. And at Michigan State, when I started there, it was a pretty traditional school. So I kind of designed and created all the class related to like sustainability and industrial ecology. So that's something I really like to do, to get like students more interested in that area and understanding more the broader impacts of like what they're designing and the product they're doing, and all this system thinking idea. Thanks.
And I'm Abigail Hunter. I, as was mentioned, work for the Quebec government, and you might not notice that because of my Anglophone roots and accent, so I'm happy to have a Nick next to me. I'm also joined by my colleague, Marielle, who's sitting in the back. People are surprised to hear that Quebec has 9, soon to be 10 offices across the United States. I'm leading federal engagement for Quebec and DC, and Marielle is in our office in Boston, which covers New England. The reason we have such a large presence is because we put such an important focus on our relationship with the United States. You are our largest trading partner. 70% of what we make goes here. And actually within the US, New England is the largest trading region. And Connecticut takes the cake and #1 with $3 billion, over $3 billion of trade with Quebec every single year within the New England region. So that trading relationship, the foundation of it, and connecting it to the topic of this panel is really based in materials, minerals, trade. And the best example, and probably the most important example I can give to you on that, is aluminum. Quebec produces an incredible amount of aluminum, and that is important for our New England-Quebec aerospace corridor, which Connecticut is an integral part of. And the reason we have this abundance of primary aluminum in Quebec is actually due to a long-standing defense relationship we have with the United States. In World War II, the U.S. invested in aluminum smelters in Saguenay and actually put a defense base right next door in Bagotsville to protect those smelters. They were essentially building up the arsenal of democracy for the Allied war efforts, and many of those smelters remain there today. 9 out of 10 of Canada's smelters are in Quebec, producing 60% of North American aluminum. And because we rely on our hydroelectricity, it's some of the greenest aluminum in the world. Unfortunately for you guys, my obsession with aluminum doesn't stop there. I also moonlight as a grad student myself. I'm at Johns Hopkins SAIS studying sustainable energy and writing my four-part capstone thesis on decarbonizing aluminum and the paradox that lies within that. I'm really tired. So for that project, I'm writing it for a think tank, their Center for Strategic and Industrial Materials, SAFE. And I'm really proud to say that the first part of the publication came out today looking at the paradox for aluminum's energy use. And so essentially, it's described in the 2 lectures before this, very aptly by our keynotes, and then alluded to also in your remarks, the cost of these energies, the cost of the fuels for these energies and the materials. So we looked at in the report how aluminum is used for many clean technologies. 85% of solar PV components are made of aluminum. And then aluminum is key to the battery electric vehicle transition, as those batteries are weighing down the vehicles, and aluminum helps lightweight them in the frame of the vehicles. And then also, as was mentioned before, critically important to our transition to clean energies in the transmission infrastructure, particularly overhead transmission infrastructure, as we connect intermittent renewable resources and balance them on our grid. At the same time, unfortunately, aluminum is one of the most energy-intensive metals. It gets its nickname congealed electricity because it consumes 4% of global electricity use. And so that's probably it's more than most countries in the world, I think, except for the United States, India, and China. And that translates directly into 2% of global GHG emissions. So therein lies the paradox. You need aluminum for clean energy technologies, but you also need clean energy technologies for aluminum. And that's, I think, also kind of a good way of explaining my interest and passion in this space as well. It's kind of lifting this curtain back in critical minerals, this full scope of the supply chain, not just the technologies we need, but their component parts, where we get them, where we extract them, process and refine them, whether that's secure, I think is a secondary important benefit of these conversations, making sure that the supply chains in their full scope aren't necessarily creating new national security vulnerabilities. So what I'm excited about, looking forward to in this career, hopefully many of you will have with me in critical minerals and material sciences, is updating the arsenal of democracy I mentioned before to meet the challenges of the day, whether they're climate change challenges or whether they're geopolitical threats in our supply chain vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Thanks, Abigail. Sarah.
So beer or no beer?
I can't comment on that. My personal interests in beer are too strong, but.
It's hard to go after such an esteemed set of panelists, but my name is Sarah Stewart. I am the CEO and executive director of a new nonprofit. We're called the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Our hope is to do really, really extensive research and analysis, but then sweat the details of accelerating policies forward. So that's been very exciting, and we've got lots of written materials on our website, which I encourage you to look at, including on this topic. But how I got here, I thought might be interesting to you all because I was also a law student, and thought I was going to go into criminal law, and here I am. That didn't pan out, but it was because I started my legal career in international trade, actually. And I worked on behalf of U.S. manufacturing companies, steel, aluminum, ball bearings, and windshields. So really sexy trips around the U.S. where there were basically no hotels or places to eat. So that's what you have to look forward to if you go into that area of the law. But it was really gave me a lot of insight into some of the issues that companies are grappling with, including with materials and including with their environmental footprint. From there, I actually went and worked for an environmental NGO, and so that was a very different experience and vantage point. And it was at the intersection of trade policy and environment. Which I think is a really growing field, and I would encourage all of you to think about that as you're, coming up with your career ideas. From there, I went on to work for the U.S. government. I worked at the U.S. Trade Representative. I was a trade negotiator. The new NAFTA update, that environment chapter, was something that I worked on from start to finish, and really proud of that. But unfortunately, it didn't include some of the issues of today, even though that was only 4 or 5 years ago. And so now at Silverado, we're kind of bringing all of these different threads together, including a number of others. And it was funny because about 18 months ago, after we had just launched, we were doing a lot of work on semiconductors. And at the same time, part of the team was doing a lot of work on clean technology. And we sort of had our various streams of work meet over critical minerals, and realizing that there's truly a finite pot of minerals out there that are not just being drawn upon for clean technology applications, but for many, many types of applications, whether it's aerospace and defense or semiconductors or all sorts of medical devices. I mean, really, almost everything that you can think of is dependent on this kind of one finite pot. So when we think about demand going up for example, electric vehicles, which we know is going to happen, and it already is happening, the minerals that support that, such as lithium, are also used in these other applications. So what does that mean? It means that over the next 10 to 15 years, we are going to have a growing supply and demand mismatch. Companies like, at U.S. Strategic Metals, where Michael works, are doing an amazing job. In our estimation, we're going to need to, have that on steroids, really, because just looking at 5 or 6 different critical minerals alone, including cobalt and lithium and copper, we're talking about 300 new mines needing to come online in the next 10 years, just to serve the demand for clean technology, let alone the demand from all these other applications I was just talking about. And when you think about the fact that a new mine takes about 15 to 17 years to come online, that's a problem. In addition to that, we've got some geopolitical issues. The U.S. imports the vast majority of its minerals, and hopefully that will change. But at the moment, we've got a pretty significant import reliance on minerals coming from Asia, and in particular China. We have escalating geopolitical tensions with China. And so having a single source of supply, regardless of whether or not it's your best friend or it's your worst adversary, that is a choke point crisis waiting to happen. So I think we're at a really pivotal moment. And, I think having events like this to kind of broaden the awareness to not just the DC policy circles, but also to the next generation of practitioners and, and policymakers is really critical.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And that was also the perfect segue sort of to the next round. You mentioned this big growth in demand that is expected for basically all the energy metals. And so far, we haven't heard much yet about recycling. There was a question on the circular economy. And I mean, another way to answer, you're saying we need so many more mines. Well, why don't we recycle just more? And there just maybe a simple comment is that the recycling industry, the one with the sweatshirts that Tom said that is not very sophisticated, has over decades is doing well with the big metals, with the steel and aluminum and some zinc and some copper recycling, nickel recycling because it's expensive, and not much more. So we have, on the other hand, these 60 elements, of which 50 of them, they are not, or until very recently, or let's say until 10 years ago, until the whole criticality discussion started, there wasn't much awareness. Oh my goodness, yes, when you recycle something, like we have an alloy, a metal alloy that has the main alloying element, say is iron, then the iron will be recycled in that alloy, but the spice elements, or whatever it is, they will likely not be reused, they will be downcycled, and therefore they will be lost. So that is something that over the last 10 years, there was a lot of sort of all of a sudden like this wake-up call and realization, well, we need to do much better. And I would say over the last 10 years, a lot has changed. There's a lot of R&D going on, but this is relatively slow when you compare the growth in recycling availability or knowledge of these specialty metals compared to the change in demand, et cetera. And that's why I'm so excited that Michael is here, because you only mentioned right now in your introduction the sort of the mining that your company is doing, but you also have started or developed a new technology for the recycling of the lithium-ion batteries. I believe from cars is the focus. Probably I would think
also
in terms
commercial.
of mass. Also
commercial
okay.
Batteries.
And I would just be curious that you talk a little bit more about this, also in terms of How did you develop this technology? Was this sort of, was there sort of collaborations with industry, or with academia, with national labs, and also, you mentioned before Glencore. I mean, is Glencore sort of somebody who had because you were still working with them as sort of an associated partner? And also, the second part of that question would be, whatever you did successfully, what kind of lessons would you have for other sectors like solar, or for any other wind turbine recycling industry that also is trying to work on these things? How did you pull it off, basically?
It's a big question, Barbara, and we haven't pulled it off yet, right?
Okay.
We're very close to pulling it off, but it's a good point, and I have to say, all things considered, we're actually accidental recyclers. We started out on a Superfund site that was leaking lead. Our DNA, U.S. Strategic Metals DNA, is cleanup. We're an environmental cleanup company. This is after my Glencore career. I was out to pasture. I was coaching Pop Warner football. And I get a call from a friend of mine who is cleaning up a Superfund site. And they're specialists at this. They're one of the best companies in America. It's called Environmental Operations Incorporated, EOI. And they clean up environmental waste sites. So there was a lead mine, a 100-year-old lead mine in Missouri that was leaking lead out into the neighborhood. It was owned by a billionaire named Philip Anschutz, who owns a bunch of sports teams, and he's an oil and gas guy. But he knew there was possibility for more cobalt and nickel on this mine site, so he bought it in the late 70s and did a bunch of drilling, and it never worked out, and there was this environmental overhang, so he just wanted to be rid of it. So we started out just cleaning up the site and noticing in the tailings on the site, 3.6 billion pounds of tailings, they'd taken all the lead out with the old 1930s technology. It was actually the National Lead Company, which built the mill, and they were involved in the war effort, lead, for obvious things for the war, the World War II. And we were just cleaning it up, and we noticed in these tailings, this giant tailings impoundment, 40 years of mining, was nickel, cobalt, copper, like 3 of the hot metals in 2017. So I got a call from my friends, and they said, "What do you know about cobalt?" I said, "I don't know anything about cobalt, but I know the guys that do," right? My friends were the traders at Glencore. They trade a third of the globe's cobalt. They own 2 of the biggest mines in the Congo, and they trade a lot of more tonnage. So 150,000 ton market, they trade about 40,000 tons of cobalt. But they said, listen, if there is cobalt in America, North America, that's mineable, you guys should try to get a hold of this mine. So we were cleaning it up, and we were just going to make concentrate. We got a hold of the mine. We bought it from Philip Anschutz. We got a administrative order of consent from the EPA that said, hey, you guys are done cleaning. You're never done, Superfund, right? You always have to keep the environmental liability. We work hand in glove with them. They're out all the time. We check oil, air, water constantly. But they said, you know what? You can repurpose these tailings for commercial use. So we built a concentrator. We saw that once you have a concentrator and you're concentrating the metals, where can you go with it? It's Canada or it's China. There's 2 places. That's it. There's nowhere else you can take a mixed metal concentrate. And we decided, no, we're going to make something different. We're going to do an international study. We got a company called Samuel Engineering. It's not Hatch or Fluor, but they were available and they're well known. They went around the world and they looked for, our mandate was we want hydromet, so not pyromet that releases gas into the environment. We want a low carbon, low emission process. Find it. And they found it for us. And the guy it's an American technology. It's a silver and zinc, chemical engineer. He's actually a surfer from San Diego, but he's a doctor in chemical engineering who is living in Bolivia, working for Comibol, doing smelting of nickel and silver. And he invented his own technology called Metalox. It worked great with our material, so we bought it. While we built this pilot plant, his Metalox, to practice on the commercial scaling of our material, we got a call from a recycler in Missouri. The recycler is called Interco Metaltronics. They have been recycling lithium-ion batteries for longer than anyone in America. They've been taking laptop computer batteries and iPhone batteries and all these little small batteries, and because they're kind of scrap people, they also knew all the scrap yards. So when the first lithium-ion batteries from cars, the Leaf or the Volt or any of those, when they would have a wreck, they would say, what do we do with these batteries? They would send them to Interco. So Interco created a process to make black mass, which is the shredded lithium-ion battery. It's then calcined, and they said, why don't you try it in your Metalox process? We put it into Metalox, it works great. So we are now a recycler. We signed a long-term contract with them. We're getting 95+% recoveries of nickel, cobalt, copper, there's a little bit of copper in there, and the lithium. And we think we can go after the manganese and the graphite, further down the road. But we're accidental recyclers, but it can be done. We did not reach out to the labs. We kind of got lucky. I mean, I wish we would have had a broader approach to it and strategically decided we wanted recycling. But the thing is, we're going to be the first to market recycling. There isn't a big end of life. There is zero end of life battery market right now. It is only battery scrap from production, like Tesla in Austin, Rivian, different places that put batteries together. They test them, and if the red light goes on, one battery is defaulted, they have to trash that battery. We're getting all of those batteries and we're recycling them. So it is coming, but it is years away, 5 or 6 years away from any significant end-of-life batteries. And there's a lot of companies spending a lot of money for feed that they don't have. So there will be winners and losers in this overall recycling game, but it is very important that we get in and do it. That's our recycling story.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks very much. Anik, sort of a follow-up question also in terms of solar. Of the metals that are being used there, which one do you think, or big solar technology, we have, first of all, 101, we have a lot of different technologies, and as you mentioned, it's not exactly clear which one will win. I think there's still sort of the juries out there, or there are different opinions, or maybe correct me. And sort of which element are you most worried about for solar technology?
Yeah, I think solar is really interesting in the way it's also linked to the geopolitical, that not all countries have the same kind of solar technology that is in the same ratio. Overall, silicon is the main technology. There's more than 80% of the market. But in the US, for historical reason, we have more cadmium telluride solar panels. We have First Solar. So First Solar has a much larger market in the US because there was tellurium from copper mining coming from Canada. So that's kind of the history of that. So and similarly, in Japan, actually there is copper, indium, gallium diselenide that is more important than other technology because they have more gallium and selenium than we have. So it seems like some of the technology that are taking a bit more of the market is based on local amount of material. The thing with solar is we actually don't need a lot of materials for the solar cell itself. The solar cells, for a cadmium telluride, is less than 1% is the active material. Most of it is glass and the aluminum frame. And I think it's important to think about First Solar because they are working on cadmium and telluride. They actually developed their recycling process as they were developing their technology. So they've been recycling their scrap materials. When they are doing research, they have their own facility for recycling that because they are dependent on tellurium for their future. It's different for silicon because silicon, if it comes from sand, really high quality sand, but people are less worried about that. So there is not necessarily as much of much work to develop the silicon recycling facilities, and that's pretty much worldwide. So the only place that they try a little bit more is in Europe because there is more requirement about silicon recycling. But what is mostly recycled in solar panels is the glass or the aluminum frame, but the glass is mostly downcycled. But I think the example of the cadmium telluride in terms of circular economy is a pretty good one because over time they are when they get old modules that get removed, they are able to make one or more than one, like 2 or 3 modules from like one old modules, because they've become more and more efficient and like better technique for making the modules. So you're making higher efficiency modules with less material. So it's a good example of that. But I'm not necessarily worried, but
okay. Well, that's good news. Thank you. Abigail, so your government in Quebec, the government of Quebec has sort of created this new program, Minerals for the Future, with the goal to become a leader in the production, transformation, and recycling of critical minerals. Could you explain a little bit talk to some initiatives in this area of metal recycling? And also, I'm thinking the recovery of critical minerals. Does Quebec mostly think of end-of-life materials or actually of the mining wastes that Mike just mentioned? Because you have so much mining.
Yeah. So yeah, and just to give a little bit of context on how much mining we do have, Quebec has half of Canada's critical minerals in our subsoil, and of those minerals, 40 of them meet the criteria of the U.S. Geological Survey's critical and strategic minerals list. And we have 33 mining projects and 22 active mines in the province of Quebec. And so with all of that information, and particularly when the USGS list came out, we did a little bit of an evaluation and put forward this plan that you mentioned, Barbara, the plan for valorization, sorry, this is me translating in my head, for critical and strategic minerals. And then we did a complementary battery strategy. And in both of those, there is so much recycling and circularity weaved in throughout, because there's this recognition that even though we have half of Canada's minerals in our subsoil, it's not enough for us to meet our own decarbonization goals, and especially because we want to be a partner to the United States, it's not enough to be able to support this market as well. So recycling is paramount. We have to have recycling incorporated in everything. So I have a few examples that kind of, one is very similar to Mike's example. We have a recycling company, lithium recycling, sorry, again, translating, where they do the black mass process, have the 95% recovery, manganese, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper. And so I went to their facility last summer. I would say it's the coolest thing you'll see, just like laying out a e-bike battery. And they'll be like, oh, those are so hard to break down. You have no idea they're meant to be industrial. And you kind of forget sometimes that, these are the things that we see in our computers, in our e-bikes, in cars, and they actually need to like break them apart and start to do the process. So that's one example. That facility, with the support of Quebec government, is recycling 200,000 batteries a year, I believe. If it's not 200,000, it's 20,000, so forgive me for that. Another really interesting example that we have is Rio Tinto, which is a major mining company, has facilities in Quebec. They have a titanium and ore facility that I was able to visit, and they did a pilot project where they were able to get scandium from their tailings. And scandium is a critical mineral that's abundant, but it's in short supply when you find it. So the fact that they were able to, in their titanium dioxide, be able to extract and purify high purity scandium oxide is really important. It's the first scandium project that North America will have, and it'll produce 25% of scandium. And scandium, it helps aluminum solidify. It's a microalloy, so obviously I love that. It has defense applications, clean energy applications, but it also used in LED lights and different electronics as well. So that's a really incredible project that has a circular lens to it. And then the last example I'll give is when we approached our battery strategy for the province, we really focused on brownfield sites that were previously aluminum smelters, maybe, to create an ecosystem where battery manufacturers all the way from the upstream, midstream could be able to work off of each other. So we have a couple of, it's very much focused on the midstream precursor, cathode active material, and cathode active material, which we're able to produce with a smaller energy footprint because of our hydropower, and then export to Tennessee, the battery belt in the southeast that's popping up, where you guys can essentially manufacture the cells, modules, and put them in the vehicles closer to the final site for delivery. And the other product from those processes where you're making the PCAM and the CAM is sulfur dioxide. You can double check. I texted my battery expert before this to make sure I'm saying the right thing. I'm not a chemist. I should have gotten that degree instead of the sustainable energy one. But so that's one of the offputs that comes out of it too. And then that can be used in fertilizer, which is another area that we obviously have critical mineral concerns about because there's security implications of how much is dominated by the Middle East. And so that's one offshoot. And then another one, we're making clean hydrogen, green hydrogen there as well. And then the offshoot of Air Liquide's project there is O2, which is used in the CAM materials. So what our battery team did is they said, when trying to attract these companies to Bécancour, it said, okay, you're producing this and you don't need it, you can sell it to your next door neighbor. And so this kind of circularity exists within our ecosystem that I think is something that we need to push policymakers to think through, and also the companies to kind of be able to capitalize on those efficiencies, because otherwise we're not going to be competitive against Asia. Good Asia, bad Asia. You know, we have to be able to maximize these logistics supply chains and efficiencies that exist within the products.
Excellent, thank you. Sarah, I want to talk a little about this idea that we have. On the one hand side, you have countries that have the ores and they are the big miners, but then the production, the processing of the materials typically takes place far away somewhere else. So everybody is trading, obviously, from A to B. And I think the goal, what now everybody realizes, is this mine to market, basically supply chain, to have that ideally local, and everybody sort of would have that. And what's sort of in terms of reality check, could you talk a little bit sort of why this is, or sort of what are sort of the main sort of trade streams in this respect, and which are the minerals where this gap is maybe most pronounced?
Yeah, I think that this is a great question, and it's probably one of the most eye-opening angles to this issue from a policy perspective that I've looked at, and I'm sure that it's also perplexing from a business perspective. But if you think about it, you've got the mineral extraction phase, and then that ore and concentrate needs to be processed before it can, go into a further downstream product. When we just did a recent analysis and had a big event in Washington, D.C., and Michael was there, which was great, and many others, Rio Tinto and others, and we had the U.S. government and the Canadian government and the Argentine government, and then many other sort of outside the Western Hemisphere governments as well. And we looked at some of these issues, and what was startling is that if you look at just the Western Hemisphere alone, the ores and concentrates, there's a lot of naturally occurring minerals that are in the Western Hemisphere, and the ores and concentrates that are being mined there, 85% is leaving the Western Hemisphere and going to Asia for processing. 85%. I mean, that is an enormous, astronomical number. And consider that as you go further down the value chain, there's more value that's added. So we are leaving quite a significant amount of money on the table, of jobs on the table, by having so much of the processing being done outside of our region. Okay, so that all being said, nobody wants processing. And that is something that we're going to really have to grapple with as a country, as a region in Western Hemisphere. And there is not a overnight sort of panacea that I can see on this, but I think that understanding how this supply chain works and understanding where some of the vulnerabilities are and where we have these highly concentrated areas of the supply chain, that's going to help us to think about the strategies that we need to build more resilience. And Professor Ali was making some really interesting points on nearshoring and friendshoring and onshoring, and there's all this shoring that's happening or being talked about. This was one of the reasons that we wanted to bring together this group on just looking at the Western Hemisphere, and there's many other different regions that you could look at, but just looking at that hemisphere, you've got highly developed countries like the US and Canada that have money, but also resources, but then political sort of winds that are blowing in different directions. But you also have very resource-rich countries in Latin America that also want to be players in this game, but are having a really hard time selling projects because they have political instability or, rule of law issues, and those investments need to be de-risked. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, and I don't think that we necessarily have to make it a, north versus south. It can be an integrated look at how we do this, where developing countries are brought into the mix. But the biggest takeaway would be single source of concentration for any one portion of the supply chain is dangerous, and resiliency needs to be built in. It can be done in a variety of ways.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I would like to open to the audience. So if you have questions, maybe just say to whom the question is addressed, and then we'll take it from there.
Hi, thank you for all of your insight. That was super fascinating. And just to the very recent point that, Sarah, you mentioned about how there's a lot of resources in Latin America that could be explored. Latin America is also a host for a lot of huge areas of forest. And I think there's also some concern with mining causing deforestation. Would you be able to discuss how this conflict with each other, and is there a resolution, and how this can progress in the future?
Yeah, actually, this is a great question. And when I worked in the government for the U.S. Trade Representative, one of the issues that I dealt with was in the Western Hemisphere, saving the Amazon from deforestation from a variety of different sources. It is a real concern that we need to have about what are the trade-offs of the different decisions that we're making to support the different needs that we have. And I think that we have learned a lot about extractive methods, whether it's in terms of fossil fuels or now kind of looking at some of these minerals that we need for the clean technology transition. We can engage in some of these practices and operations without having it to be so exploitive, and putting the safeguards in place on the front end to make sure that those things don't happen. It's not going to be perfect, but what I do know is that we have a moment of opportunity where companies and governments and local communities and consumers can all benefit from making, policy choices that take us towards decarbonization with less extractive methods and more virtuous supply chains. But we have not put all of that together yet. I think it's imperative that we do. It can't just be clean technology, decimate the forest. That is a choice that has a lot of nuance to it, and we really have a window of opportunity to address it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm really excited to hear about recycling and how you're participating in refining these materials. I'm just curious about, so we all are targeting to meet $100 per kilowatt because that's the price where electric vehicles are going to cost the same as gas vehicles. So I'm just curious if you see your investments and your work as a short-term investment, or if you plan to expand your operations beyond what we need right now, keeping in mind that the U.S. released an executive order to make sure that batteries cost $80 per kilowatt. So I'm just curious about what's your intent into a long-term investment and having your operations expand to make this a circular economy.
Is that for me, for U.S. Strategic Metals? Well, the long-term business plan is that the green revolution is here. It is one of the biggest disruptions that we will see in our lifetimes, right? It's transportation and energy. Both of those segments are being completely disrupted by batteries. And it's not going anywhere. So I think it's a great place to be. But just echoing what everyone has said up here on the panel, the fact that we are talking about how to do it the right way, how to do it clean, green, how to look at non-deforestation. I mean, for example, our mine, because we're a Superfund site and the EPA people, we have 1,800 acres that we reforest every part of it that we're not disturbing the land, we reforest immediately. Now, in my career in mining, all over the world, Siberia, Indonesia, everywhere else. I mean, Indonesia is a big one. The islands are literally made of cobalt and coal and everything, and they just strip it all off, and it goes straight into your iPhone battery. We're not doing that here. Our regulations in America, it's the greenest mining that you can possibly have. But the miners don't tell their story well. You know, they don't go out and say, hey, come and see our site. This is how it can be done. When we came to our place to clean it up in Missouri, it looked like a dystopian hellscape. You know, it was all shimmery, shiny sand, nothing growing. Now we've cleaned all of that up. There's green trees growing everywhere. I mean, we want to have a carbon sink. We want to sell carbon credits on our 1,800 acres. It can be done in a circular way. We're also leading in circular hydrometallurgy, which you were talking about. This, we have an ammonia plant that we're working on. It's not phase 1, but it will be phase 2, where everything that we feed in can go out. So the ammonia with the ferric, you get this great fertilizer, which we know North America needs badly. Another thing is PCAM. We've just started a PCAM pilot plant, and we can handle the sodium sulfate. Now, sodium sulfate is benign, but in China, it's dumped into the ocean, right? I don't know how you guys are handling it. I'm sure you've got a safe way to handle it, but we've got the impoundments that are EPA regulated to handle that. A lot of people around the world aren't looking at it. And I think this generation, your generation, are going to be the ones that hold their feet to the fire. But it needs to be saying, do it, but do it right, and we're going to watch you. And it may cost us all a little more, like, your car might cost a little more, your iPhone might cost a little more, but let's do it right because we can. The solution is not to say don't do it. Let's just close our eyes and get everything from the Congo or other places where it's not regulated. I think we just have to watch, and it's a very good question. We need to get those numbers down and those numbers right, but it can be done. That's our view.
I can add something to that. I work a lot on batteries. So I think like in the short term, prices are not going to decrease because we need mining, but like the recycling should help for that. For any, like you talk about like aluminum, why is Quebec doing so much aluminum? It's because it's super energy intensive. If you use like recycled aluminum, it's a tiny amount of energy versus like the primary materials. That's the same thing for most materials in batteries. So when we have enough supply from end-of-life batteries, that should reduce the energy required for new materials as long as we have the technology for recycling everything, including the lithium. But then we will be able to continue reducing the price. There's also a change in the chemistry, like we're using less and less cobalt in new batteries, so that's another effect. So I think what's going to happen with the battery is the same thing that happened with like solar. Like we used to use huge amount of like silver, really thick silicon, like we've dematerialized solar panels. We produce more electricity per meter square, but we're using like half the amount of materials. So there are like technological improvement, but also an increasing amount of recycling will lead to a lower cost of batteries.
I'll add something too. I just think, sorry, is that okay? In terms of the decreasing costs of battery electric vehicles, and then the batteries are obviously the most expensive part of that currently in the car, so that plays a heavy role. I think we're seeing a real race to the bottom. Mutual friend of Sarah and mine's from SAFE, the think tank I write these reports for, uses that phrase a lot. And in terms of how countries are competing to throw incentives in a way where you can essentially, out-incentivize the companies to come and produce, in the US, in Canada, in Europe. And so we need to kind of have a little bit more of a race to the top. In the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it's like 48X has 45 cents on the kilowatt hour for battery cell manufacturing. We can't compete with that in Quebec, but we want to produce battery cells domestically and then do our PM and PCAM to export to the US market. So how can we work more, collaboratively to get to that point where we're kind of, again, leveraging current efficiencies, leveraging the USMCA that Sarah negotiated to be able to actually compete, I think will be critically important.
Thank you. I saw a question.
We've got one over here also.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks everybody for joining us. This is building off of Sarah's earlier comment, but I'd be happy to hear from any of you about diversification of supply chains. Is it right that the battery minerals tend to be much more consolidated in their production in terms of where they're produced versus like oil right now? And I'm curious if that's the case. Is that something that you think will change over time, or does the energy transition present a new sort of geopolitical risk in terms of consolidation of production of these minerals?
That's a great question. I don't have a fully detailed answer for you on that. I don't know if any of the other panelists do. I have a more global answer, but yeah.
First of all, so I would say the main battery metals that you're talking about, lithium, I would say not a problem right now. Nickel, also geopolitically, relatively not a problem because it's spread around. Cobalt would be the biggest one. So it depends again. But then on the other hand, you could sort of react to that. There are different chemistries that are being developed with higher cobalt or lower cobalt. So by switching to lower cobalt, you could sort of get around that pretty well. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. I don't think it's strikingly different for batteries than for other technologies, in summary. So, yeah. Next question. You were waiting the longest.
Hi. I have a question about the lag in time it takes to develop these mines, which, Sarah, I think you said takes sometimes as long as 15 to 17 years, which strikes me as a really long time. And especially on the electric vehicle battery and commercial scale battery front, we're seeing a pretty exponential increase in demand for those batteries. How is the industry dealing with that kind of time lag and really intense demand right now with kind of maybe not a ton new supply in the next few years, beyond obviously price increases?
So I can go with that one. If you've seen recently, there have been a couple of big announcements like Lithium Americas. So GM just invested $650 million in a mine. And we're talking to all the big OEMs as well. So we're getting to a situation where they're realizing it's critical. They may have deals with battery makers. They may have deals with traders. And I'll never forget a conversation I had with Tesla about 4 years ago about where are you getting your Cobalt from? And they said, well, it's all coming from one trader. And I said, well, where does the Cobalt come from? They said, well, it comes from the Philippines. And I said, well, look at your demand and look at how much the Philippines produces per year. And we know the other places the Philippines sends their metal to. There's no way it all comes from the Philippines. Why do you think that? And they said, well, Panasonic told us that's where it comes from. And then I said, well, where do they get? And so they got a certificate of origin, and it was a Chinese smelter, right? So they really didn't know where that cobalt was coming from. And it is important that we do get to the bottom of these. And I know that's not what your question was, but they are realizing it. They know that if they buy from Glencore, that doesn't mean, Glencore can supply them the metal, but if they buy from Panasonic or they buy from LG or SK, it doesn't mean that all that raw material is there. They're looking at mines. So this is a way they're trying to do it. They're all in talks with mines, mostly lithium, but nickel. You've heard Elon talk about nickel like crazy, and they're also looking at cobalt. And we do lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper. So if you're listening, any of the big OEMs, we're ready to talk.
Yeah, one thing I can add to that. So from a life cycle perspective, what should be the best thing to do after the life of a battery in a car would be to dismantle it and keep like most of the pack is still good. Like I've done a lot of testing on that. Like usually 95%, 99% is good. There's one bad cell. So you should take that, then do like a second life battery, put it in storage or reuse it for another like 5 to 10 years. So what the company don't want, the manufacturer, is that to happen. Because if that happens, that prevents the material to go back into the supply chain. So like right now, that's why there's so much investment in recycling. They want to take those batteries out from the car directly to recycling. So I think right now there's kind of a fight of, from an environmental perspective, like a sustainability, you should use, there's still like value and life in that battery. But from on the short term, until we can have more mining or more supply, the manufacturers want that battery material in particular because like the first battery, similar to like tellurium, we can do like 2 panels with one B4. With older battery, you can do more batteries because we're using less and less cobalt in the batteries. So they want them to go back for recycling so they can make new materials.
On the permitting side of your question, I think, it's different in Canada, obviously, in all different mining jurisdictions. But we testified to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee last year on this particular issue, and a lot of people are really jazzed about the time it takes to permit mines in this country. And, Dr. Ali mentioned the mine in Minnesota that didn't get its presidential certificate. The Biden administration has this new interagency working group on mining that brings together DOI, White House CEQ, and then DOE to kind of figure out how do we triangulate this tension between where we're getting things domestically and this need for batteries. And at the helm of DOI, or Department of Interior, you have our first Indigenous secretary, and she's got her back towards the wall with some of these governors and members of Congress who really want to do domestic mining. It's really a challenge. I think what it comes down to, and this isn't unique to mining, this is all clean energy technologies, I think, given some challenges we're seeing in other parts of the country on transmission infrastructure for Quebec within the United States. You have this, NIMBYism in the U.S. No, I should correct the jargon, but like not in my backyard, banana, build anywhere, or I forget what that one is, but that one's funnier. Essentially, just not wanting people to see what's actually being built. And so what happens there is you can kind of coalesce these groups, these frontline groups of people to kind of vote in referendums against this stuff, to put pressure on their elected officials. And then all the while, time goes on and there's litigation after litigation after litigation. And then you're just costing the mining company, the proponent, the transmission infrastructure company, so much money, the developers, and all these different projects that they just kind of balk and they don't want to do it anymore. And so what we do in Quebec that I think is particularly interesting is there's a lot of concern about what you do with the sites afterwards, kind of the waste question that happened earlier. And so we have to put forward, Quebec proponents have to put forward the full cost of reparation of the site, which is a pain apparently to them, but it's great for, social acceptance. And then they also, on the front end, engage with the First Nations communities in Quebec, with the communities that are surrounding the mine, with the proponent, the investor, the Quebec government, all around a table being like, okay, this is what we're trying to do. What's the process for permitting? They're involved every step of the way they meet. And again, we're a small jurisdiction, right? Provinces have jurisdiction over critical minerals and natural resources writ large in Canada versus the US. It's a shared jurisdiction in different places, so it's a little bit more complicated. But I think that that's kind of some of the constraints that this interagency working group is trying to work through so that we can have high standards enshrined in the mining processes without necessarily just canceling every single mining project that could come online.
Thank you. You had a question. Yes. Here, second row in the middle. Yes.
Hi, so my question is for Michael, but anybody who can answer, please feel free to. So as somebody who's currently trying to research new technologies for metal recovery and trying to make these really precise metal separations, I think something that the field of metal recovery is lacking directionally right now, at least within academia, is information really from industry on the actual composition of mine tailings and industrial wastewaters. In terms of, knowing what to actually focus on, so we can make these precise metal separations. And so I guess, and I've tried, it's really challenging to reach out. No one in industry wants to tell you what's in their wastewater, but that's what we need. And so I guess my question is, how can we better bridge the gap between industry and academia? And maybe we need, advocates or some kind of other means of communication. But I feel like that's really hindering progress right now. So I don't know if you could discuss that.
Yeah, I can just say about our Metalox technology, it is a special IP, and we haven't patented it because we were told by our patent lawyers, once you patent it, it will be stolen. So do not patent any trade secrets. Just make it a trade secret and try to keep it in-house. And we've been vetted by some big groups, like Hatch has come in, XPS, which is the Glencore associated tech team, that they had a competing technology called Albion that we didn't go with. And they came and vetted us under NDA and everything. They said, this is a really elegant solution. It's an it's an acid leach, but it's relatively low pressure, relatively low temperature, and it separates everything, but our downstream is SX. It's solvent extraction, well known. Crystallization, well known. So as far as the water stuff, I think we're going to be pretty transparent. I know we have to be for EPA regulations on wastewater. We are constantly being checked. So as far as wastewater, I think we will have data coming out soon. We're in pilot stage, so we're not publishing any of that. But once we start getting going in September, you'll be able to see all of our wastewater stuff. But our secret mixture in the Metalox process, we don't want anybody to know. It's really almost too simple. People have called it an elegant solution. Why didn't I think of that type of thing? We don't want anybody to know because we think, they can just stamp it and print it all over the place and we'll lose our edge.
That might have to be our last question.
We have one more? Okay, go ahead.
I do whatever Tess says. Yeah.
So much for the last question. So based on what we read online, it seems that for all the metal recycling technology, for the first 5 years, you usually require around over 50% virgin metals. So wondering whether that's the case you've seen in your technologies or other cases. You've seen like technologies that can do recycling without requiring that many virgin metals at the beginning. Is that clear? Or? Sorry?
For batteries?
I think this sounds to me very technology specific and also metal specific, because in the ideal world, if you can really recycle and purify and clean your material, it should be like a virgin material, and then there's really no choice. It's contamination or tramp elements, reducing them. So it seems to me more like a regulatory issue, like right now we don't trust that the purity is better than X, and therefore we want this, but I wouldn't think that this is something that has to be that strict, that can change.
Yeah, I think for a lot of it, even like for aluminum, like people would like to have more recycled content aluminum because it lowers their carbon footprint, but it's more that there is not enough supply. So that's the same thing even like for new batteries, like in Europe, they are doing like the passport on batteries, so you'll have to report like your carbon footprint. So that would be better if there was like the way of getting a lower carbon footprint would be to use like recycled materials. So like battery manufacturers for a car in Europe would want to have more recycled content, but the limit is on what they can get from used batteries. But I don't know any of that 50% number. And like the number I've seen for aluminum, for example, is more based on like how much you can get of high enough quality. But aluminum in particular, usually you can get pretty high if there was enough supply for that.
Yeah, I think not all minerals and even like the different types of within the minerals are created equal. And just building on the aluminum example, you can't use recycled aluminum for specific applications, like defense applications, for example. You need it to be very high purity, and there's a limited amount of producers that can make that. And then the same thing, like when you're recycling like a building frame, you can't recycle the building frame aluminum into, a car door. It's not, there's not kind of cross-sector recyclability. Mm-hmm. There's limitations there for now, at least. And so, yeah, I think Barbara's right. It's very technology specific. You just happen to have people who like aluminum on this panel can answer to that.
Well, I can give the same example. Like if you have a lot of glass in solar panels, you cannot recycle glass from solar panel for a bottle because that's not full grade material. So there's also a lot of rules like that. So it's really hard to get recycled glass for solar panels because, or use the glass from solar panels in something application because there's always like metals and other things that you don't want in your process. So that's a non-aluminum example.
Thank you, and I think we continue outside at this point.
Yes. I will give 2 minutes of announcements, but first let's thank our speakers. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, recognizing that we're holding you all from food, first, I want to thank you all for being with us today. I was delighted to see the turnout, see how many of you all were here today. Thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you especially to our supporters, CBAY, the Kimball Smith Series, SOM Energy Club, the Center for Industrial Ecology, and the YSE Energy and Environment and Business and Environment Learning Communities.